Without further ado, our supervising lawyer for CLEP Libertas, retired Judge Maria Corazon Gaitel Yanderal, will now introduce to us our lecturer for the series. Judge?
Thank you, Cheska. Good afternoon, students, teachers. I see Attorney Tontoneri, who is head of Executive Director of SUCLA, who is also present here and also head of the CLEP. Friends, I am most pleased and honored to introduce to you our guest resource speaker for this afternoon session. Dr. Lee Yarsha is both a lawyer and a physician who works in the field of public health and human rights. Lee received his medical degree from the UP College of Medicine in 2012 and his Juris Doctor degree from UP College of Law in 2018. Yes, there are people like him, both doctor and lawyer. He further received executive training in public health leadership from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and executive training in public health research from the University of California, San Francisco. During law school, Lee worked as policy and research officer of No Box Philippines, a nonprofit organization with consultative status at the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs. He later worked as a litigation lawyer of Poblador Bautista and Reyes Law Offices and as the Chancellor's legal officer at the Philippine Judicial Academy of the Supreme Court. Presently, Lee serves as the National Program Officer at the United Nations Joint Program for Human Rights for the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, advising the UN country team on health and criminal justice portfolio matters. He is also a senior lecturer of constitutional law at UP College of Law and faculty member of the UP College of Medicine, where he teaches medical jurisprudence. Lee has published his works on public health and human rights at the Harvard Health and Human Rights Journal, the Philippine Law Journal, and the International Journal for Human Rights in Healthcare. His book chapter on drug policy reform is available at Ateneo Press publication on drugs and Philippine society. With that very impressive background, I cannot think of anyone who is more qualified and competent to speak before us on the topics we have for today and next Saturday. So I am most honored to welcome Professor Lee Yarsha. You now have the floor for this digital space.
Thank you very much, Judge Ason. Thank you also, Cheska and Attorney Tonton, for inviting me to join your session for today. It's actually my own personal pleasure to once again work with Judge Ason. I met Judge Ason when I was still starting my legal career, and I got inspired with very progressive visions from judges from HUCOM, no? And as you know, Judge Ason comes from that organization as well. So I'm also very happy to share the work that we do on drug policy reform at the UN Joint Program for Human Rights. Allow me to share my screen so that I will share my PowerPoint presentation for today. Cheska, can you confirm that my slides are being flashed?
Very clearly from here, Professor.
Thank you very much, Cheska. So good afternoon, law students from Xavier University. I understand that this is the Libertas Clinic, and we also have some law students from the other clinics as well. I was requested by Judge Ason to present on the legal history of drug use and laws in the Philippines. So allow me to wear my professor hat on this time. I also teach legal history at our university, and so this presentation is informed by some of the principles that we understand when we look at history from the lens of law. But at the same time, this is very much informed by our work at the UN Joint Program for Human Rights. So this presentation is an advocate's position. As you know, when we look at the law, there are many perspectives. There are many ways on how you can narrate a story. And as part of my ethical transparency commitment, I want you to know that the lens that I'm wearing is an advocate's position for human rights. I want to begin my presentation with a story from my favorite book, Sophie's World. I'm not sure if you've read this, but Sophie's World is a book on the history of philosophy. In Sophie's World, so Sophie is the main character. She's a young student of philosophy. And the professor, the captain there, the professor asked Sophie, look at the world around you. So I invite you to do the same thing. And so Sophie looked around her. She saw the flowers are very colorful, the trees are green. She saw that the earth is very lively. And then the professor asked Sophie one more time, wear these red lenses, and now, once again, look at the world around you. Sophie said she sees everything the same thing, but now everything is color red. The captain then remarked, that's because the glasses limit the way you perceive reality. Everything you see is part of the world around you, but how you see it is determined by the glasses you are wearing. So you cannot say the world is red, even though you conceive it as being so. And so the way we view the world, the way we view history, the way we view the Philippine culture, and the way we practice law, it's influenced by the frames that we use to look at the world. But it's not just the quality of the lens that shapes our understanding of the world. Look at this photo, for example. Cheska will be my favorite student now. Cheska, what do you think is this photo?
Professor, I think it's a photo of a strawberry that's very
Of a
close up.
strawberry. Okay, very good, because it's color red and you can see some seeds. No, so with this frame of vision for the photo, you can deduce that this is a strawberry. But because your frame was limited, actually, it's a photo of a rooster, because you're looking at it from a very limited frame of lens. And as you go along, you realize, and this is one realization in legal history, our understanding of the world is limited by the size of the frames that we use to look at the world. And so for this presentation, I want you to have an understanding that as lawyers, we will be wearing lenses and frames, and that will shape our understanding of the people and the laws in the context of drugs. And one thing that you'll realize is that this is not just one of the sessions where you try to understand one special topic. In the practice of law, you will realize that lawyers are actually historians, because we try to understand the meaning of the law by looking at history. You look at the context, you discover the meaning of the law, a constitutional provision, by looking at the way people's values are when they use a specific word, for example. So lawyers are historians. We do a lot of legal history. But as lawyers, we need to be aware that we are not designed nor trained to be historians. We are trained to read cases, we are trained to read the Constitution, but we may not have all the right methods. In particular, because lawyers advocate for a legal position. No? So for example, when later on, I'm sure one of you will be a clerk of court, or one of you will be a judge, one of you will be a prosecutor. You will be an advocate of a legal position. So when you look at history, you will get artifacts that support your position. So some of the critics would say lawyers are bad historians, actually. Even judges and justices may be limited by the historical artifacts presented to judges and justices. Because, as Judge Oson would probably say, the decisions are based on pleadings submitted before us. What can you get from these discussions? You will now realize that the task of history looking is not an easy task. And there's a certain consciousness that you need to take into account when you revisit history. It is that we need to be aware of the lenses that we use. We need to make sure that the frames are big enough to capture accurate version of history. And at the same time, we need to understand that we shape our understanding of history. And as we go along my presentation of the legal history of drug use, I want you to know that when we have a conversation and when we look at history, we are also acting as our own frames because we are human beings. We have feelings, we have cultural upbringing, our values are shaped by experience. So we need to be critical of ourselves when we look back at history because our objective for today's session is to attain objectivity, to get as close to the truth as possible. Okay? Absolute objectivity may be too ideal because we have limited documentation of history, but we need to make sure that we have that values of accuracy and sincerity, that desire to know the truth. No? Growing up, we've learned a lot about drugs. We have our perspectives and understanding, and maybe our stereotypes on people who use drugs. We may have some cultural upbringing on persons deprived of liberty. But for this session, I want you to be aware of the lens that we are using and try to approach an objective lens, no, when we are listening to the version of history. How do we do that? Because we have to use history. How do we do that? The lens that I will suggest we will use for today is based on our mandate from the 1987 Constitution. The 1987 Constitution is our founding document. This should guide our role as lawyers. I will read it because I think we have a very good preamble in the 1987 Constitution. It says there, we, the sovereign Filipino people, imploring the aid of Almighty God, in order to build a just and humane society. These are the two values that we will use for today. The values of just and humane society. And so even though we might not attain an accurate version of history, we will try to get to as close as to the truth as possible. And at the same time, we will use the lens of a just and humane historian. Okay? And I also want to emphasize that this lens is very important because even the Constitution says we need to give highest priority to the protection of our human dignity, which goes to our humanity, being humane. And ultimately, hopefully, when we have this lens, it will lead to our basic purpose as lawyers, which is to promote the happiness and welfare of the citizens. Okay, that's quite a long introduction because I want to make sure that our attitude entering this class is something that is very open. Some of our discussions might be a little new and radical in some ideas. And in many presentations where I've given this, there are many questions that are asked afterwards. And I'd be very happy to answer them. In fact, I received a lot of questions from Judge Ason. When I look at the questions, there's a lot, and I tried to integrate them in this presentation. The first question from the students, and I integrate this in my presentation. What are the key events or periods in Philippine history that have had a significant impact on drug use and drug-related laws in the country? In the pre-Hispanic times, the historian Antonio Pigafetta, when Antonio Pigafetta arrived in the Philippines, one critical description of Filipinos is that Filipinos have red-tinged teeth. So in the history books, Filipinos are described as people with red-tinged teeth. And the reason for that is very ubiquitous in different parts of the Philippines is the chewing of areca nut mixed with lime and wrapped with betel leaves. This is a psychoactive substance. I'm not sure if any of you come from the province, but if you eat areca nut or the nganga or the buyo, if you eat that, you will have a psychoactive effect. You will feel refreshed. You're very stimulated. People, before going to their daily chores, in the morning, they would nganga, they would chew areca nut mixed with lime and wrap because of the psychoactive effects. And it's very ubiquitous in early pre-Spanish times. In fact, in your history class, in the first chapter of Noli Me Tangere, the host there was offering buyo to all visitors, because in early Philippines, offering a psychoactive tray of buyo is the essence of urbanity. It's an act of courtesy and politeness in every house. So before you can participate in any social gathering, no, you're offered, it's like a welcome drink that we have right now, no, offering a tray of buyo for people to feel refreshed, for people to feel stimulated. They have this practice of offering a tray of buyo. And we also have a record of Rizal through his letter to Dr. Mayer. No, he has a friend called Dr. Mayer, and he sent a letter on his experience with psychoactive substances. And this is the translation. Let me try to ask help from some of our students. Christy Hinakay, can you help me read the translation of the letter of Rizal?
Yes, Doctor, good afternoon. So the letter provides that, my distinguished friend, I received your letter of the 27th of last month, and excuse me for not having answered you before this, for I have had to consult some countrymen and books concerning your question about the hashish. No book, no historian that I know of speaks of any plant whose use is similar to that of the hashish. I myself, though, in 1879 used hashish, did it for experimental purposes, and I obtained the substance from the drugstore. I do not believe that its use had been introduced before or after the arrival of the Spaniards in the 16th century. The Filipinos drank arak, nipa palm, and coconut wine, etc., and they chewed buyo before the arrival of the Spaniards, but not hashish. Neither is a word resembling it found in the language. The is or asis is a kind of wild fig tree. If I had Father Blanco's flora, I could find out if this plant exists. I believe, therefore, that its use is unknown. Opium was introduced only after the arrival of the Spaniards. We Tagalogs call it apian. I am here at Brussels at your disposal as always. If you could give me an introduction to some employee of the library, I would appreciate it. Most affectionately yours, Rizal.
Thank you very much, Christy. What we can see from this historical artifact is that substance use is present in the Philippines. In fact, Rizal himself used hashish. Hashish is a type of marijuana that we know today. No? So Rizal used hashish for experimental purposes. He is relaying that Filipinos use many psychoactives such as alcohol, arak, nipa palm, and coconut wine. He also said that opium is present in the Philippines, and Tagalogs call it apian. And hashish in the early 1870s, no, is not something that is quite popular. But what you can see from this historical record is that drug use is also something that is well documented. Many of the historical records, when you look at drugs, there is no distinction between a plant-based drug, whether it's food, whether it's in liquid form, or whether it's eaten or smoked. No, as long as it has psychoactive effects, that's considered drugs. And in Filipinos, even until now, when you say fiesta or feasts, as in the Spanish time, it's more understood as drinking alcohol and not just eating food. So again, drug use figures in a cultural part of the lives of the Filipinos. No, if you're in the province, almost every week there's some feast happening in some barangay. No, and Filipino feasts are understood as drinking a psychoactive substance, alcohol. There's also a political function for drug use. If you mix a psychoactive substance with blood in a tradition called sandugo, it's a way of closing the political ties between two tribes or between two groups of people. No? So one tribe and another tribe, if they agree to form a treaty at that time, no, an agreement, a legal agreement, they do it through a ritual called sandugo. In about 1800s to the start of the 19th century, no, the Philippines started to participate in world commerce. We had a lot of agricultural products that we transported to the rest of the world. What was the importance of our trade? No, we had a trade with the Mexican galleon trade. We had trade with China. We were exporting a lot of Manila hemp, tobacco, corn. because of the agricultural boom in the Philippines at the time, we needed more Chinese workers. So there was a migration of Chinese workers in the Philippines. No? And when we opened up to the world, opium became such an industry. It's a regulated industry because workers during the day and at night, they would go to an opium den and then they would smoke opium. So from pre-Spanish time, until the Spaniards coming here, substance and drugs, psychoactive substances and drugs are being used by the Filipinos. And they're documented to have been used from any walks of life, whether you're a farmer, whether you're a priest, whether you're a nun, whether you're Chinese, whether you're Filipino, everyone uses psychoactive substances. When the Americans came, this is where we started to establish a different approach for substance use. Well, when the Spanish were here, they already had a dual policy for substance use. There's what they call a monopolio in opium. So it's regulated, but there are restrictions in the way you can use opium. But when the Americans came here, they established the prohibition framework for substance use. One colonial inheritance that we got from the Americans is a comprehensive punitive system for everyone, regardless of nationality, if you use opium in a non-medical manner. In fact, at an early point in history, one of the records would say that the Americans also wanted to transplant prohibition on alcohol. But there were documented revolts, revolution in the Ilocandia. Filipinos really pushed back. No? So what was eventually criminalized were certain substances. Alcohol was, in the United States, it was prohibited at a certain time. But in the Philippines, the prohibition framework was not successful for alcohol. But what was successful was the introduction of the penal code, criminalizing non-medical use of opium. And this is a product of the US diplomacy all over the world. Because the premise from the American frame of mind is that intoxicating substances are morally wrong and injurious. If you use substances, then it can release your inhibitions. It could lead for you to become a more violent person, or you will not be a productive member of society. So that's the spirit behind the prohibition framework that we inherited from the Americans. This is what we call the sin and sickness model. If you use it non-medically, either you might have a psychiatric disorder, or you might be committing some moral error. No, in this way, it became a crime. No, it became criminalized to use psychoactive substances, and so we had precursor laws. If you recall, in the Tydings-McDuffie, no, the Americans said, okay, we will allow you to create your own republic, create your own laws. And so when we had the revised penal code, and then we had the Dangerous Drugs Act. In the Dangerous Drugs Act during the martial law, it was a very punitive framework, and there was a public execution of one person involved in drug trade, Lim Seng. And now we have the Comprehensive Dangerous Drugs Act of 2002, still reflecting the same prohibitionist perspective from the Americans. What are some of the key provisions in the Comprehensive Dangerous Drugs Act of 2002? There are many. I'm sure you studied this in your criminal law too. But I'll focus to two, because these are the common cases that you will encounter probably in your CLEP. No? One is drug use. Drug use is a crime under Section 15. You will, the language of the law is, there will be a 6-month compulsory rehabilitation, court-ordered, and after 6 months, if you use drugs again, you will be punished with imprisonment for 6 years and 1 day to 12 years. So, Drug use for the second time under Comprehensive Dangerous Drugs Act of 2002 is punished at the same penalty as slavery. So it's as if you are enslaving another person if you use drugs for the second time after a failed attempt at compulsory rehabilitation. What else? Section 5, drug sale. Selling is punished regardless of the amount or the purity of the substance. So as long as there's selling is punished by imprisonment of 12 years and 1 day to 20 years. It's the same penalty as if you killed another person. So this is the same sin and sickness model that we inherited from the Americans. Either you are a patient if you use substance use, so there's the sickness model, or it's a sin, criminally, morally wrong, morally unjust. And so society will imprison you for engaging in drug-related activities. Okay? So I hope I answered the first question. What are the important parts of history that shape the current drug law that we have? A big part of it is a colonial influence on our legal system. Another set of questions that I got from the students, in what way does a moralistic approach to drug policy fail? In what way has it failed to address the contextual reasons for the use of psychoactive substances in society? Are the provisions specifically intended to prevent drug use under RA 9165 effective? So in a way, this group of questions asks, what are the effects? Has it been effective? If the intention is to prevent drug use or to correct some moral reasons for using drugs, has it been effective? So let's look at the evidence. What are the realities on the ground? I will cite the case of People versus Holgado, GR number 201, parang sobra yung GR number. I'll correct that later. 11 August 2014. The Supreme Court said, in relation to the application of RA 9165, it is lamentable that while our dockets are clogged with prosecutions under RA 9165 involving small-time drug users and retailers, we are seriously short of prosecutions involving the proverbial big fish. We are swamped with cases involving small fry who have been arrested for minuscule amounts. So what is the main effect of the criminal justice approach under 9165? We have been imprisoning people who use drugs and involved in transactions for minuscule amounts. There is one study cited in People versus Casa, a 2022 case. The Supreme Court eventually looked at the past 10 years and they surveyed appealed drug cases. So in the first column, you will see the year from 2010 until 2021. Okay? And then you will see the columns on sale, possession, delivery, and transport, reflecting the amount of shabu in grams. Look at the amount. Let's say sale. From 2010 to 2021, 0.12, 0.06, 0.1, 0.07. These are all very minuscule amount. How about for sale? From 2010, 0.17, 0.24, until 2021, 0.29. And many of the cases that you will handle in CLEP is on sale and possession of very, very small amounts of shabu. How about in terms of the value of the amount? The same survey looked at 2010 to 2021. Look at the amount here. From 2010, 200 pesos. 2011, 300 pesos. The most expensive that I can see is 2018, 1,000 pesos. And remember, the punishment for sale is 6 years. No, 12 years to 20 years. No? For use, that's the 6 and 12. No? For possession, I want you to revisit that. But we are a very punitive society for a very minuscule amount and very small value. Has it been effective? The Supreme Court, the findings of the Supreme Court are actually reflected in local data from the court. So the data that I presented are from appealed drug cases. So I asked from Judge Ason an inventory of some of the drugs that they have in CDO, so in your court, no, in your area. In the last inventory that I received, the 2022 inventory, the seized drugs were virtually all packaged in sachets, 1 to 3 sachets, 5 sachets. And almost all of the 174 cases weighing less than 1 gram of shabu. What's the implication of a very punitive framework that we have? This is a data on persons deprived with liberty with drug cases by classification. I want you to look at the grand total column at the rightmost side, grand total. The total says we currently have 90,662 persons deprived of liberty. Look at analysis number 1, footnote number 1, analysis number 1. There are 90,062 persons deprived of liberty out of 131,311 PDL population. About 70% of our whole jail population are just on drugs. And you look at the amounts that I've shown a while ago, all of them 1,000 pesos. That's the highest amount. All of them less than 1 gram. So I revisit the question of the student. Has it been effective? The question of effectivity is a complex one, no? But later on, I'll have a more thorough discussion here. What I will say is that this is the clear effect of 9165. We have been imprisoning people for very, very minuscule amount. And the one I showed you are on jails, no? But actually, from 2016 to 2022, they are not in jails, but we have deprived liberty of many individuals, 345, 216. We've arrested them in other areas, either they're in PNP custodial settings, or they may be in a community, but they're under a watch list, so they're required to report regularly, or else they'll be detained. No? In 2021, 104,663 detained on drug-related cases. Another problem here is that 38,300 are non-bailable. Because they are engaged in sale, they cannot bail. And at least 528 days. That's the average waiting time for someone who has been imprisoned for drug-related offenses, for pre-trial detention. This is pre-trial detention data. Okay? So from the community and their families, what we do is we uproot them from their families, we arrest them, we place them in prison. You see, one question that we'd like to ask, our laws are very punitive, but why do people still use drugs? So there are another set of questions that were given. Do we have any insights? Why do Filipinos still use drugs now? Before, as I mentioned in history, there are cultural reasons, there are political reasons, there are economic reasons. No? During the commerce boom in the 19th century. No? But now, do we have insights? Why do Filipinos still continue to use shabu or marijuana? Why do people sell drugs even in small amounts? If the consequence is they will be imprisoned. We did an ethnographic study in 2018. What is an ethnographic study? An ethnographic study is one where an anthropologist will live with the community. Basically, the researcher will go to the community and makikitambay, makikipamuhay, makikisama. There are different tools that they use, and they want to investigate the daily lives of people. The question that we wanted to answer, why do people use drugs despite a very punitive framework? What we found is that shabu plays the roles of pampagilas and pampagising. It helps people feel more energetic and alert as they work at night or for long hours. We were able to document cab drivers, pedicab drivers, port workers. Okay, they have to wake up at 4 a.m. and then they have to stay awake until night. Because what's our economic structure in the Philippines? We are a labor-intensive country. If you don't have your physical energy, then you won't have money to bring to your table. Okay? And for many of our respondents, shabu plays pampagilas and pampagising, especially for the port workers. And in my legal medicine class, we study psychoactives. You will know that if you take methamphetamine, it's a hunger suppressant. For people who use shabu, you don't get hungry. You eat less because you feel energy. And so if you're a part worker and you're competing for clients, no, those who can skip meals get more money. And so this is reflected in many parts in the Philippines. Filipinos use shabu for a functional purpose. They have economic reasons for it. How about for marijuana? In the same ethnography that we conducted, we found that marijuana enhances merrymaking during inuman or drinking sessions. And that actually formed the highlight of their social life. No? So some of the students that we were able to interview and had tambay sessions with, they would usually gather during the weekends and they will have marijuana sessions. That's when they talk about their life stories, and that's an integral part of their social life. And so the students asked, transmitted to me with Judge Ason again. So is there an issue of drug abuse here that intersect with other social issues in the Philippines, such as poverty and crime? And how do we address these complex challenges? I will redirect this question to the findings from our ethnography. If we know that the reason for involvement in drug trade and drug use are related to economic reasons, or probably social, cultural reason, what solution should match those concerns? What we are realizing now is that imprisonment is an unmatched solution to economic reasons for substance use. Imprisonment does not address any drug dependency or drug abuse issue. Imprisonment does not address the need for livelihood alternatives that provide sustainable lives for people to have food in their table. And these observations from our data will continue despite this prohibitionist framework, because Filipinos will continue to use drugs. They will continue to engage in low-level transactions for economic, social, and cultural reasons. And the only effect of a primarily criminal justice approach is to arrest more people, detain more people, prosecute more people, and incarcerate the poor. A solely criminal justice approach has then not met the goals of addressing the root causes of drug-related issues. Another question that I got from a very long list of questions that were transmitted to me: what potential challenges and concerns, such as public safety and legal implication, do we need to be addressed if we will pursue decongestion? How can this be mitigated effectively? Let me unpack this question. The question suggests that if we do not imprison, there will be public safety issues, because essentially we will bring people outside of closed settings. And the question is, if we decongest, will we address public safety issues? Okay. I'd like to address the premise first of the question, because the premise assumes if you use drugs or if you're engaged in drug transactions, then there's a public safety issue. Then there's a violence issue. We looked at the data from 2012 to 2015. This is a data from my office, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. Look at the pie graph in the left side of your screen. The pie graph, the whole pie, represents homicide statistics. Okay? These are the global data on homicide all over the world. The dark red shows 63% not involved in any psychoactive substance. Okay? People are engaged in violent activities without any substance relation. How about those with psychoactive effects? 37%, the lighter red, represents those related with psychoactive substances. But take note, if we unpack the psychoactive substance, look at the next chart. 90% are related to alcohol. And it's not even on shabu, which comprises majority of our persons deprived of liberty. That means from the global data, we find that there is no connection, no automatic connection between drugs and violence. The question of crime and in criminology, and I'd like you to do more research on this, is a complex issue. Even if a person uses or does not use drugs, there's no automatic connection to public safety. In fact, if we look at psychoactive substances, alcohol seems to play a larger role. But I want you to take a reflection, your own reflection. Do you drink alcohol? I'm sure in some instances, after a very difficult exam, you might have been very intoxicated. But did you commit a crime when you drank alcohol? Did you punch your seatmate just because you're a person who used psychoactive drugs? Not automatically, right? Because each of us are unique individuals. Behavior and psychology is very complex. It's not just because there's alcohol, there's shabu, there's marijuana, then there's a public safety issue concern. What we have to look more deeper is on criminogenic tendencies. What contributes really to crimes? No? Well, at this point, what we can conclude is even if we put people who use drugs, alcohol outside of closed settings, there is no automatic connection with public safety issue. How about for dependence or abuse? We find actually 86% of people who use drugs do not need any treatment because there's no dependency, there's no drug abuse. No. If we look at the issues from a health perspective, in fact, tobacco and alcohol are more problematic substances than drugs. This data is what we call years of healthy life loss due to disability and premature death, so DALYs. No? So in medicine, in public health, we measure the cost of a substance through what we call DALYs. Drugs only constitute 9% of the DALYs, no? The disability and premature deaths. No? Most of the problems are on tobacco and alcohol. But look at the way we respond in society. Do we imprison people for smoking tobacco? Do we force people to do rehabilitation because they smoke or drink alcohol? The treatment is very different just because it's drugs. And so at this point, I'd want you to have an opportunity for reflection. How do we really address issues of people who use drugs and involved in low-level transactions? Do we imprison people? Or do we go at a more scientific understanding of the contextual reasons of why people use drugs? More importantly, how do we build now our communities? Now that we have a very punitive system, how do we build the lives of people who use drugs? How do we improve human development indices? Another question which I find very useful as an opportunity for reflection: if you're a parent, you have a child, what will be your approach when your child uses drugs? Or maybe you know that the child was selling one sachet of drugs. Will it be imprisonment, or will it be something that is framed from a supportive, humane, and just perspective? What we advocate for, and this is where I wear the advocate's hat now. As I mentioned, as part of my transparency commitment, now I am looking from an advocate's position. We want our drug laws and policies to promote a just and humane society. We know that status quo is not working well. And somehow we are having some inroads with the present administration. From Justice Secretary Remulla, he said, President Marcos is refocusing the anti-illegal drug campaign, tackling the source of the problem. He has stated that the criminal masterminds must be apprehended and punished, not small-scale users on the street. This is a big thing. The government now is recognizing we should not punish small-scale users. We should emphasize on the need for rehabilitation, prevention, education, and assistance to victims and their families. President Marcos in his SONA said, the campaign against illegal drugs continues, but it has taken on a new phase. It is now geared towards community-based treatment, rehabilitation, education, and reintegration. Community-based, which means your roles as CLEP students, because you are bringing people away from jails and closed settings back to their communities. Of course, as lawyers, we know that the more sustainable approach is changing the law, because 9165 will always be there. At least from the Philippine government, they have a commitment. They said, in light of the Philippine administration's new direction to approach the drug problem through the prism of public health, for persons who use drugs and small-time peddlers who got involved in low-level transactions due to health, social, and economic factors, they will review 9165. Okay? We hope that this comes, this should have been done yesterday. This should have been done ages ago. But this is something that we need as advocates to push strongly on. It's time to change the drug law. In the meantime, while you are in your clinical legal education, there are some interim measures that we can do so that we can bring people back to their families, back to their communities. Look at the first column. The first column would be where we want people at, back to their community, back to their families. We want where they can be promoted, where there are public health services, where there are supportive services, where there are social alternative livelihood. We want to bring them in the communities. How do you do that? You have some tools. I hope you learned the skill of, these are not perfect tools. Plea bargaining would be a very problematic solution. Even bail, you would need to get money, speedy trial, recognizance, even parole and getting into your records. So there are some tools that we can use to bring them out. It might not be perfect, but we will try our best to optimize what tools we have as of the moment. Because one thing that we know, if you are in jails and prisons, the condition is very inhumane. One, you will age. We have documented that one concrete harm for a person who comes there, they age a lot faster than people in the community. Their health conditions are so bad, food is so bad, you don't have sunlight, air, things are so bad, there will be a direct physical harm to you. You will really age. Second is the trauma, the traumatic experience of being in jail. You will have stigma and discrimination. Even if you come out of jails and prison, it will be with you. People will see you and tag you as someone who came from jail. You'll have difficulty in getting proper employment because of the record. And you are not connected with your families. You for years, months, years, you will lose a big part of your life, building with your family. And so there's an important work that you are doing in CLEP. We want to bridge and bring back families, people who are deprived of liberty back to their families. And I wanted to use all the tools that you have and that you can learn from your clinical experience. We have a longer vision, which is what we call a diversion deflection model. And we might need a law for this. Essentially, if a person is involved with drugs, the idea is we bypass the criminal justice system. We decriminalize. We just link them to a health sector where we can do proper assessment and then refer them to health promotion, harm reduction, rehabilitation, livelihood support, or socio-economic development. Okay. I think that these are the final set of questions that I have from the students. So the students asked, what can we do now to improve human rights claims in the Philippines? And in the context that I mentioned, what is a human rights-based approach and how is it different from the present demand reduction and supply reduction? How can human rights-based approach be integrated into policy development and implementation to ensure the protection of individual and community rights? I'd like you to take note of what we call as the human rights-based approach, or an approach that is based on human rights. What does this mean? And based on the question, how is this different from the previous approaches that we have? Okay. If your policy framework is drug demand reduction or supply reduction, what is your goal? Your goal there is a drug policy objective. You want to reduce drug demand. You want to reduce drug supply. But when you say human rights approach, you set aside first the policy objective, but you focus on the human person. Your inquiry is in the human person. There are distinct implications for this. If your focus is, let's say, let's create a drug-free community, let's stop drug demands, let's do drug testing so that our drug policies are met, you forgot the implications of the human person. You forget the direct effects of a drug-free framework. And so what we mean to say with a human rights-based approach is you focus on the vulnerable and the marginalized, including the poor. And you use that as the foundation for your approach. What is just for people who use drugs? What is humane for people who use drugs? Another important principle in HRBA, and you know this from your constitutional law too, is that HRBA foregrounds the relationship between the individual and the state. Remember, when it is your right that is being restricted, you don't have the burden to justify your human right. It is the state that should justify why they are imprisoning people. Is it something that is working? Because if it's not, then it's not the means test, but the means and the ends test. You don't satisfy that. Another core principle in HRBA is that inherent dignity is the foundation of our approach. Inherent dignity means people have dignity regardless of drug use, drug dependency, or being placed in a position of deprivation of liberty. And we prioritize the health of the person, and that includes physical, mental, and social well-being. Some reforms that we argue for and we push for is let's refocus our criminal justice system to big organized crime groups. Let's bring people who use drugs and involved in low-level transactions to health and social welfare. Let's promote alternatives to incarceration and non-custodial measure. And we need our prosecutors to work closely with our police to ensure human rights policing. This is another big issue, a lot of issues on buy-bust, planting of evidence, human rights issue that we need to address. I want to have some parting quotes from one of my favorite decisions, People versus Almonte, a separate opinion by Justice Leone. And I'll read this. Persons deprived of liberty do not shed their humanity once they are taken into custody. Yet the perennial congestion that plague our jails do not reflect this. I'll rephrase this first quote. Justice Leone is saying, if you are placed in a jail condition, it's as if you have shed your humanity because of the very undignified situation in jails and prisons. Instead, they reveal our failure to respect the very fundamental rights that the state has guaranteed to protect. Persons deprived of liberty are in need of more remedies to ensure that their detention do not prejudice their right to live. It's not even just right to health, your right to live. In our data, 2.5 more likely you will die if you're in prison than you're outside prisons because of the problematic condition. So that's just unacceptable in a civilized society. Jail congestion harms so many individuals, most of them poor and therefore invisible. We cannot just watch and sit idly by. So very, very important parting words from Justice Leone. Okay? And of course, from the UN, we say that this is a work that involves everyone from the whole community of nations. We have a faith in the fundamental human rights, the dignity and worth of the human person. And to do that, we need to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. Okay. I'd like to thank Judge Ason for inviting me. We were just together in the Harm Reduction International Conference where the vision of the organizer, a world in which drug policies uphold dignity, health, and human rights. Maraming salamat po. I believe there's still 4 minutes for question and answer. I'm sorry for taking a lot of time. I wanted more time for Q&A, but there are just so many questions that I had to answer. And maybe I'll be able to answer some more next week. Okay? I'll turn over the platform to Cheska. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you, Professor Lee. For now, since we still have time, the floor is open for everyone here to ask questions. If you would like to raise a question, you can unmute yourself and start speaking.
Actually, since we have some time, I have a list of some of the questions which I was looking at. No, maybe I can take one of the questions here, which I was not able to address anymore. One question is on decriminalization. The question is, what does decriminalization of drug use mean? Okay, is it the same as legalization? Let me clarify. No, there are different drug policy frameworks. Decriminalization simply means we will not punish a person for a certain act. Okay? And under our criminal law, diba, when you say it's a crime, it's either imprisonment or payment of fine. No? So decriminalization has a very simple effect. Its simple effect is we will not imprison a person for substance use or involvement in drug sale. Okay? Now, what is legalization? Legalization is very different. Legalization is creating a product or an industry as legal. That means the government allows for a certain product to be an industry through a regulation, for example. So if, let's say we will legalize medical use of cannabis, that means the government is now allowing practitioners or some industries to participate in a legalized industry. Okay. Another area is regulation. Related to legalization, with regulation, you create policies that will regulate or provide restrictions, guidance, provisions in relation to substance use. Okay? Those are very different drug policy framework. From a human rights perspective, what we are just saying at this point is that we don't punish people for involvement in drugs. Yan. Okay na siguro yan for one of the Q&A. Over to you, Cheska. Thank you.
Okay po. There were so many questions submitted by our clinic members, and I believe that a lot of them have been addressed in today's lecture. And anyways, if there are more questions, there would still be a lecture next week. But before we end today's part, we'd like to have a photo op with Professor Lee and everyone here in the meeting. So can we have everyone turn on their cameras for photo op? And my co-facilitator Camille will be taking the photos.
Hello everyone. So on my screen, I have 3 pages of students. So we might have to pause for a long. So wait lang. For everyone, sige. 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay. Isa pa. 1, 1, 2, 3, smile. Thank you so much.
Thank
Okay,
you. Thank you very much, po.
Thank you, Professor. So this ends today's lecture. Thank you again, Professor Lee, for today. And thank you everyone for attending. I hope we all learned something, and then I hope to see you all again next week. Good evening.